Right, so when revising for Skipton Castle, the best thing to do is to focus on the big three periods that I've highlighted on the screen. You've got early medieval, which is 1090 to 1400, early modern, 1500 to 1750, and then the 20th century, which is 1900 to 1999. The late medieval and the industrial periods, they're there for completeness, and we'll talk about them a little bit. But when you're answering on your questions for Skipton Castle, you want to be answering using early medieval, early modern, or 20th. Just really because they're the big three, and they've got the most content that you could answer on. So we'll start with the early medieval, which is 1090 to 1400. Now, the way that we're going to work through each one of the periods is that we'll talk about some of the physical features that change and the content of, what actually changes at the castle. And then we'll also go through the information that will help you answer questions. So how is it typical in this period, or why is it locally or nationally important, or what changes about the castle and why. So we'll go through those questions as well as we're going through the content, but there is a separate video on how to answer the Skipton Castle questions if you want a little bit more of an intensive walkthrough of how do you approach the questions and what to do. So we'll start with the early medieval then, which is 1090 to 1400. So Skipton Castle was built by Robert de Romney by land given to him by William II. Now, the area of Craven did not have a castle, so William II wanted Robert de Romney, as his Norman lord, to build a castlery in this place. Yorkshire was known for being rebellious. They'd had the harrying of the north, and so William II asked Robert de Romney to build him a castle to control the area of Craven. So it was built in 1090 by Robert de Romney as a Motte and Bailey castle. Now, the Motte and Bailey castles are originally built of wood and earth, so they're temporary. They're not massively permanent, but they can be built quickly. Skipton Castle was built on a rocky outcrop. Now, if we remember, that rocky outcrop is where there is a sheer drop behind of 30 metres down to the Ellerbeck. And this rocky outcrop has a number of benefits. It means that it can only be attacked from one side because you can't climb a cliff to attack it. And it also gives it a panoramic view. Because it's high up, it means that they can see all around the area of Craven. Skipton Castle was also built on some old Roman crossroads, and it was on an arterial route, and that means that it was on a really important road, basically, between Tadcaster and Ribchester. So another reason it was built where it was built was because of its connections. It was well connected for trade, but also to move soldiers to and from the castle. Another reason why it was built in its location was because it was on the site of an old church and very, very Christian Catholic society. In the early medieval period, Robert de Romney felt that by building the castle on the site of an old church, it showed that he was of high status, that he was close to God, and that maybe he might be more respected by the Anglo-Saxons because of his high status if he's building a castle on the site of a church. So the idea that he's building it there to give himself status. So in terms of the changes that happened to the castle in the early medieval period, the castle was originally built in wood as a Motte and Bailey, and in 1135 the rebuilding in stone begins. So they start to rebuild it from wood into stone. It's necessary really for two reasons. The first one is that wood rots and burns. In the rain it rots and attackers can easily burn the wood. So it needed to be upgraded because it wasn't hugely strong defensively. But the second reason is that it was being attacked by the Scots from the 12th century. So in the Scottish Wars of Independence, Skipton Castle in the north of England was one of the first castles to be attacked and repeatedly attacked. So they needed those stronger defences, and upgrading the castle to stone was the sensible option, really. There was a change in 1166, so a new law meant Skipton Castle had to have a prison under the gatehouse. So in 1166, they build a prison under the gatehouse, the dungeon that you guys have visited, and it became a really important part of local law and order. So it was used throughout the medieval period to hold people who were awaiting their trial or people who were in debt. Between 1192 and 1195, they build a new inner gatehouse at Skipton. That's built by William de Fours the First for additional protection. So it's sort of an extra gatehouse to get through before you get into the main heart of the castle. In the 1220s, William de Fours II makes the castle more luxurious. He starts to modernise it, and he adds the Great Hall, he adds the private apartments, and he adds the kitchens as well. So it's all making the castle more luxurious and more comfortable. Later on as well, they build the withdrawing room, and the withdrawing room tells us about daily life because it tells us that their attitudes and values towards women were that women were second-class citizens. Women had to withdraw to the withdrawing room after dinner while the men discussed business and politics. In 1311, Robert Clifford adds the outer gatehouse and the curtain wall. So again, Robert Clifford, the first Lord Clifford, he is adding more defensive features to the castle, the outer gatehouse and the curtain wall, meaning that the castle is better protected, particularly from the Scottish attacks. So that shows us that life is dangerous and life is not safe due to those Scottish attacks. He also builds the chapel of St John the Evangelist in the grounds of the castle. Robert Clifford doesn't want to pray with the peasants who work on his land. He wants his family to have a place of private prayer. So that tells us about life as well, that there's hierarchy and that there's a class divide, because Robert Clifford doesn't want to pray or have family services amongst the peasantry. So in terms of beliefs, attitudes and values then in the medieval period, we've mentioned this, all three of these already really. The patriarchal society, the physical feature of the withdrawing room next to the Great Hall, tells us that women were second-class citizens. After dinner they would be sent to the withdrawing room, which was attached to the Great Hall, so that they could sew and tell stories and talk and play music, whilst the men discussed business. John Clifford in 1311 building the curtain wall and the new outer gatehouse tells us that life was dangerous and that they needed additional protection from attack, particularly from the Scottish attackers. The third thing that it tells us is that there's divisions in society. The chapel of St John the Evangelist tells us that Lord Clifford didn't want to pray with the peasants. He wanted a separate place of prayer for him and his family. So again, showing that there's hierarchy in society and there's class divisions. Market Charter was granted by King John to Skipton Castle in 1204, and the Market Charter brings a huge amount of wealth to Skipton. It allows it to have a regular large market, and it still happens today that they have the market a number of times a week. It brings huge wealth to the castle because traders come from all around to trade their goods. And they come to the castle rather than going to other markets because the castle offered them protection, and the castle makes them feel safe when they are trading their goods. It's also an effective market and becomes a very powerful market because it's on that arterial route. It's on a main Roman road, and the Roman roads are still used in the medieval period as the main ways of getting around. So it's still on a main route between Tadcaster and Ribchester. In terms of the activities that might go on at Skipton Castle in the early medieval period, we've got the taxes and the manor courts held in the Great Hall. Now, peasants would come from all around to the Great Hall to pay their taxes to the Lord in either money or in goods. The Great Hall would also be where the Lord would conduct the manor courts. So it would be used for the Lord to take his taxes off peasants and also to hold the manor courts in the Great Hall. So if we were doing that as an answer, the Great Hall would be our physical feature. Possibly also the dungeon if we're talking about manor courts and holding people before trial. Another activity would be women being sent to the withdrawing room. Now, in the withdrawing room, as I've said, they would sew, they would play music, they would tell stories. Meanwhile, the men would talk business or politics in the Great Hall. So an activity you could talk about would be the women in the withdrawing room after dinner. The final early medieval activity you could talk about would be the private services and prayer in the chapel of St. John the Evangelist. Now, the Clifford family, as I've said, don't want to pray with the peasantry. So you could say as an activity, well, they have private services and private prayers in the chapel of St. John because that is their private chapel that they build. So if you got a question on early medieval activities, you could choose early medieval, and these could be your 3 points that you would talk about. In terms of why Skipton Castle's important, you might get a question that talks about important nationally or locally, or both. So we've given you a few options as to reasons why it's important nationally for the whole country, but also locally as well for the area of Skipton. So in the early medieval period, it's important nationally for the Norman consolidation. The Normans invade in 1066, and as I mentioned at the start of the video, they struggled to keep control of the north of England. There's lots of rebellions. So it's important nationally because Skipton Castle was a key part of their control in the north. They build Skipton Castle because they want to control the area of Craven and the northern parts of England as well. It's also important nationally for protection against the Scots. We've said that in the 12th, 13th and 14th century, there's repeated attacks on Skipton Castle, particularly from Scotland. And these Scottish attacks in the Scottish War of Independence, Skipton is important because it's like a buffer, it's like a fortress in the north of England to protect against those Scottish attacks. In terms of it being important locally, it's really important for the feudal system. It's the centre of feudal life. If you think back to year 7, we've got the feudal system where the peasants work for the lord on his land around the castle. So it's important to give people a role. It provides them with a job, with like a production of food. So it's really important for the running of day-to-day life. Skipton gives everybody a role in society, ensures that society runs smoothly, and that there's been enough food produced both for the lord and his family and for the local area around. So the lord provides them with protection and with a job in return for them paying taxes. So in terms of your 3, I'll just flick back a slide. In terms of if you've got a question on why it's nationally or locally important, for early medieval, you could do 2 national and then the 1 local that we've just talked about for the feudal system. You may well get a question that asks about significant points in the site's history. Now, the significant points of the early medieval period might be its rebuilding in stone from 1135, or it might be the Scottish attacks as well. So they could be your 2 significant points. The rebuilding in stone is significant because it means that the castle lasts. It means that the castle remains in a good condition because it's built of stone rather than sort of wood and earth. You could also talk about the Scottish attacks being significant because they're the moment that the castle starts to add more defensive features, like when John Clifford, the first Lord Clifford, he builds the curtain wall and the outer gatehouse. So it's significant because the Scottish attacks mean that there's new defensive features being added to the castle. If you got a question that talked about significant physical features from the early medieval period, you could talk about the round drum towers and the curtain wall, the chapel of St. John, and the withdrawing room. This question, though, we've got to be careful on because we've got to explain why that feature is significant. What does that feature tell us about life in the early medieval period? Why is it important? So the round drum towers and the curtain wall, they're important because they provide defence for people, particularly during the Scottish War of Independence. They provide defence for the castle, and they show how dangerous life was at the time. The Chapel of St. John is significant because it very clearly shows the class divisions in society. It shows that the Clifford family don't want to socialise or to pray with the peasants or anyone lower than them in society. The withdrawing room is a significant feature that you could pick out because it shows that patriarchal society, that society is male dominated, that women are not viewed as equal to men, and that they're not suitable to be discussing business or politics in the Great Hall with the men after dinner. So those three could be significant physical features from the early medieval period. You might get a question on challenges and benefits in the early medieval period. Now, a challenge is something that's a problem with the site, something that's hard for us to understand or to work out from studying Skipton Castle. A benefit is something that's really good about Skipton Castle. It tells us something, or we can learn something from it. So again, we've put 3 points together for 3 paragraphs about the challenges and benefits of Skipton Castle in the early medieval period. The first big challenge is that the Motte and Bailey is no longer there. It was built in 1090 as a wooden structure, a Motte and Bailey, but it was rebuilt from 1135. So as a historian, that's a challenge to us because we can no longer see the original Norman Motte and Bailey because it was taken down when it was rebuilt into stone. The location of the castle, though, is definitely a benefit. It's still in the place that it was originally built. So it's still located on that rocky outcrop, built in 1090, and it's still got the sheer cliff with that 30-metre drop down to the Ellerbeck below. So this is definitely a benefit for us because we can clearly see as historians why the site was built in its location for defence. We know exactly why it was built. It can only be attacked from one side. It's got the panoramic view. And we know these things because the castle is still in the same location as it was when it was originally built. The last point is definitely a benefit in that Skipton Castle is one of the best preserved medieval castles in England. There's so many medieval features that we can still see, like the curtain wall, the chapel of St. John, the withdrawing room, the Great Hall. And because those things are still there, because those features are still there, we can understand the views and attitudes that people had at the time, such as attitudes to women in the withdrawing room. If those rooms weren't there or they weren't in good condition, we wouldn't necessarily understand what they're for or why they're there. But because they're in such good condition, we can understand about people's attitudes and values at the time. In terms of the typical question, you might get a question asking, how typical is your site in a certain period? Now, if something's typical, basically what it means is it's common, it's regular, it happens in other places. So if Skipton Castle is typical, it's like other castles. If Skipton Castle is not typical, it's not like other castles. Now, what's important in this question is that you must give, so you're writing 3 paragraphs, but you must give at least one on each side. So you must give at least one typical and at least one not typical. In the same way, for the challenges and benefits, you need to give at least one challenge and at least one benefit. So again, we've put together 3 points for you, 2 typical and 1 not typical. In this question, it's really important that when you're saying why it's typical, you refer to other castles. Because to say whether it's typical or not, you have to say, well, it happens in this castle or it doesn't happen in other castles. So it's really important that when you're writing your answer, you make sure that you've got those castles revised so that you can use them in your answer. So the first reason why Skipton Castle is typical in the early medieval is that it's built as a Motte and Bailey. Now, hundreds of castles across England were built by the Normans as Motte and Baileys. So Skipton Castle was built as a Motte and Bailey by the Normans in 1090 by Robert de Rommy. So it's typical of its type because hundreds of other castles were built by the Normans as Motte and Baileys, such as Sandal Castle and Clifford's Tower in York. So we've mentioned there 2 other castles that we're saying, yeah, Skipton Castle was typical because other castles like Sandal Castle and like Clifford's Tower were also built as Motte and Baileys. The second reason it's typical is that it was rebuilt into stone. Now, Skipton was originally built as a wooden motte and bailey in 1090, but it was rebuilt into stone from 1135, and then they add the outer gatehouse in the 1190s. So this makes it typical of its type, because many castles were built by the Normans in wood, but then were rebuilt into stone because they were easily burnt and they easily rotted away. So castles like Sandal Castle and Framlingham Castle are also good examples of castles that were rebuilt by the Normans from wood into stone. To make sure that we've got balance in our answer, we need to say why Skipton castles are not typical. And one of the reasons why it's not typical in the early medieval period is that it was built as a concentric castle. So a concentric castle is a castle within a castle. So it's got multiple curtain walls basically, and so it had this extra curtain wall going around it, which was built in 1311, and obviously that's really expensive to construct because it's a massive amount of stone that you need to go all the way around the castle. So that makes it not typical, because to build a concentric castle was really expensive. So we don't have many other examples of concentric castles in England. The only other major concentric castle that we can say of note is Conway Castle in Wales. And so that makes it not typical, because they were so expensive to construct that there's not many of them around. So therefore Skipton Castle is not typical. So that was the early medieval period. We're just going to quickly move through the late medieval period, not in massive detail, just so that we understand the chronology of what happens. So the late medieval period, is 1400 to 1500, but this isn't a period that you would answer on. Between 1400 and 1500, England is in the midst of the War of the Roses. So between 1455 and 1485, we've got the War of the Roses between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Very violent time in Skipton Castle's history. Skipton Castle sides with the House of Lancaster. So even though it's in Yorkshire, it sides with the House of Lancaster. Skipton Castle was never physically involved in the war at any time. No fighting happened there. It wasn't used to store weapons or to sort of hold soldiers. It wasn't physically involved at all. During the War of the Roses, Skipton Castle is taken off the Clifford family, but then at the end of the War of the Roses, Henry VII won. He was a Lancastrian, and he gives the Clifford family Skipton Castle back. And because they supported him during the War of the Roses, he gives them new responsibility and increased their status. So with this new money and status they've got, they extend the castle a little bit and they make a few changes to the castle, but you don't need to worry too much about that because it's not something that you'd answer on. Moving on to the early modern period now. This is our second big period. So our first big period is early medieval. Our second big period is early modern. So I would recommend answering on those big three periods, one of which is the early modern between 1500 and 1750. So after the War of the Roses, England becomes a lot more safe and a lot more stable under Henry VII. And so people start to change their castles to be less about defence and protection and actually more about showing their wealth and luxury and comfort. Big change happens to Skipton Castle in 1535. Henry Clifford, so the son of Lord Clifford, the next Lord Clifford basically, Henry Clifford, he marries Lady Eleanor Brandon. Now, Lady Eleanor Brandon is the niece of Henry VIII. So Henry Clifford's done really well for himself and he's marrying into the royal family. So this brings new and huge wealth and status to the Clifford family, which they had wealth and status before, but this takes them to a new level because they're related by marriage to the royal family. So they needed to upgrade Skipton Castle to be fit for royalty. So in 1535 they build the Tudor wing. Now the Tudor wing is made up of two different features, the octagonal tower and the long gallery. And together we call the octagonal tower and the long gallery, we call it the Tudor wing. So the octagonal tower was built in 1535 for Lady Eleanor Brandon, so she could have her own private apartments where her and her ladies in waiting would live. The long gallery connects the old medieval castle to the octagonal tower. And it was a place where it literally was a long gallery with windows where Lady Eleanor Brandon and her ladies in waiting could walk and look out at the gardens if there was poor weather. They also employed gardeners to make the castle gardens beautiful for Lady Eleanor. So that change happens because of the marriage into royalty, because of that new status that the Clifford family have. The next big event in the early modern period is the English Civil War. Now, the English Civil War is between King Charles I and Parliament over issues like money and power. It lasts for 7 years between 1642 and 1649. In the War of the Roses, Skipton Castle is not physically involved. But in the English Civil War, Skipton Castle definitely is physically involved. They side with the king, so they are royalists. So the Clifford family side with King Charles I. And Skipton Castle is physically involved in the Civil War because soldiers were kept there, weapons were kept there, and it was actually fought over between king and parliament on 2 different occasions. So what happens during the English Civil War? So at the start of the war, Skipton Castle starts to change and upgrade and strengthen itself ready for war. So they thicken and strengthen the drum towers. The crenellations on the walls are made higher, so they're like the, if you imagine the top of a castle wall, you've got the bits that go up and down where people can hide behind. They're crenellations. So the crenellations on the walls were made higher. The roof was strengthened so it could hold cannons. And the curtain wall was thickened and heightened to be 12 foot thick and 15 foot high. They also built platforms for the cannons to mount on. So Skipton's prepared itself for war. It knows it's going to be attacked by Parliament, so it prepares itself for war. So if you're talking about an activity in the early modern period or a change in the early modern period, again, you could talk about its preparations for war. So Skipton is first attacked in the summer of 1644. Parliament attack it, and after 2 weeks, the siege fails. They're recalled to fight elsewhere, but they don't successfully take Skipton Castle. So it defends itself for 2 weeks in the summer of 1644, and then Parliament are recalled to fight elsewhere. So Skipton Castle's survived the first siege, but obviously it's received a lot of damage. So they then spend time rebuilding the curtain wall and rebuilding the drum towers. They're not so lucky though on the second siege in December 1645. Skipton Castle is attacked for a second time in the December of 1645. Now the parliamentarians don't actually ever break into the castle, but very cleverly they starve Skipton Castle out. So they cut off the water supply. Obviously they've got limited fresh food inside the castle. And so after 3 weeks of siege, Skipton Castle surrenders because it's so low on supplies of food and fresh water and weapons. So at that point, the king's forces are allowed to leave and Parliament takes control of the castle from the royalists. So again, in terms of activities, you could talk about the sieges of Skipton Castle as activities that happen in the early modern period. So the castle, if we just go back a sec, the castle is taken in December 1645. And 3 years later, in 1648, Oliver Cromwell is worried. Now we remember Oliver Cromwell is the leader of Parliament, and Oliver Cromwell is worried that the royalists might retake the castle and use it as a really strong fortress that it had been before. So in order to stop them retaking the castle and using it as a fortress, he deliberately damages the castle, and we call this slighting. So he had the castle slighted so that it couldn't be used again as a fortress. So the cannons were melted down and sold. The lead was taken off the roof so it couldn't support the weight of the cannons, and the walls were also thinned and lowered. So he deliberately damages the castle and stops it being a fortress so that if the royalists did retake it, they wouldn't be able to use it as a fortress. So from 1648 to 1657, the castle's empty. The Clifford family aren't in there because they were cleared out when the Parliament took the castle in 1645. So the castle's empty from 1648 to 1657. Now in 1657, Lady Anne Clifford, so she is a Clifford, she says to Oliver Cromwell, she kind of begs him really and says this is her family home and she'd really like to move back in and rebuild it so that it's somewhere where she can live again. Now Oliver Cromwell agrees, but he says you must make sure that it can never be used again as a fortress. So when Lady Anne rebuilds Skipton Castle between 1657 and 1659, it's rebuilt as a home rather than as a fortress. So this could be an activity that you would talk about. So some of the physical features that change during her rebuild, the windows which were previously arrow slits, they are now replaced with big glass windows. No good for defence, but very nice for a home. The roof is pitched, so the roof is pitched like a tent, like a traditional roof that we have today. So it can't hold any cannons. Previously in the Civil War, the roofs were flat so that they could hold cannons, but Lady Anne Clifford had to pitch the roof so that it couldn't hold cannons. The drum towers are lowered even further and then thinned out even further, again, so that they can't be used for defence. And then finally, the yew tree is planted, and you could mention the planting of the yew tree as a significant moment or even as a significant feature, because the planting of the yew tree in the Conduit Court is done at the end of the rebuilding by Lady Anne Clifford, and it's put there as a symbol of peace, to show a new chapter of peace and happiness at the castle now that war is over. So in terms of what you could put to answer questions, and I apologise, that should say early modern rather than early medieval. So in terms of beliefs, attitudes and values, you could talk about the wealthy wanting more comfort. So the beliefs of them at the time, they wanted more comfort. I'll just change that while I'm on it. So they wanted more comfort. So the long gallery, the Tudor wing, the octagonal tower, it's all showing that life is becoming more peaceful and the wealthy want to use their wealth to live in more comfort. The castle is slighted in 1648. This tells us that life's dangerous, life's uncertain. Oliver Cromwell doesn't know whether the royalists will try and retake the castle. So that's telling us that life is uncertain and life is dangerous. And so he has the cannons melted down, he lowers and thins the walls, and because, like I said, he's worried about the civil war continuing if the royalists recapture the castle. The final thing that you could talk about for beliefs, attitudes and values in the early modern period is that by Lady Anne Clifford rebuilding the castle, it's showing that life after the Civil War is more peaceful. The changing of arrow slits to windows, the lowering of the walls, the melting down of the cannons, it's showing that life is more peaceful, and Lady Anne Clifford doesn't need to live with all of those defensive features because life is becoming safer and more peaceful. In terms of activities that happen in the early modern period, you could talk about the building of the Tudor wing. You could talk about Lady Eleanor Brandon walking in the gardens with her ladies in waiting, the feasts and the dances that were held in the Great Hall. You could talk about the sieges during the English Civil War, the attacks by Parliament on the castle, its preparations for war, and its eventual surrender on the second siege due to low supplies. The third one is about the rebuilding as a home. Now, Lady Anne Clifford had the castle rebuilt as a home between 1657 and 1659. So you could talk about that rebuilding process. Stonemasons are brought in to upgrade and change the castle into a home with the new features that she wanted. So there'd be a lot of building going on at the castle at the time. So again, between 1657 and 1659, you could say that it's being rebuilt, and that's an activity happening there. In terms of significant physical features from the early modern period, significant physical things about the castle that you could talk about, the Tudor wing and the octagonal tower. We've already mentioned that they're built because of the huge increase in wealth and status of the Clifford family. So you could talk about the Tudor wing and the octagonal tower as being significant because they show that increase in wealth and status of the Clifford family. You could talk about the lowering and the thinning of the walls as a significant physical feature, those lower and thinner walls. They're showing they're significant because the castle will never again be used as a fortress. After the Civil War and after Oliver Cromwell's slighting, it's never again used as a fortress, only ever as a home. So you could say that that's a significant physical feature there. The last significant physical feature you could talk about in the early modern period would be the yew tree. Now, the yew tree is planted by Lady Anne Clifford in 1659 at the end of the rebuild. Significant, as I've already mentioned, because it shows that new chapter of peace and prosperity and wealth for Skipton Castle. Significant points. So if you've got a question asking about significant points, you could talk about these three if you chose to talk about the early modern period. The increasing status of the Clifford family, that's a significant moment. The marriage to Lady Eleanor Brandon and the building of the Tudor wing. The slighting of the castle by Oliver Cromwell is a significant point in the early modern period because after that, it's never used as a castle or a fortress again. It's only ever used as a home. And the last point you could talk about as a significant moment is its rebuilding as a home. From that moment on, Skipton Castle is only ever used as a home. It's never used as a fortress. It's only ever used as a home. And Lady Anne Clifford changes Skipton Castle so much with the glass windows, with the lower and thinner walls, with the pitched roof, that it really can only ever be a home from that point onwards. In terms of whether it's important locally or nationally, again, we've got these 2 points. I would say, to be honest, in a local and national question, I would pick the early medieval period. I think that the early modern period is more difficult to talk about in terms of its importance locally and nationally, but we do have these 2 that you could mention. So you could talk about it being important locally in the English Civil War as a place of safety for local people. Skipton Castle was used in the English Civil War during the sieges where people sought protection behind the walls of the castle to protect their families and their animals. You could also say that it was important locally during the rebuild by Lady Anne Clifford because she provided many, many jobs for local people working on the rebuild, as well as when she moves back in, she has servants, she has cooks, she has gardeners. So she's providing lots of jobs for people, both during her rebuild and after she's moved back in 1659. In terms of challenges and benefits in the early modern period, remember, a benefit is something good that we can learn from the castle. A challenge is something that's difficult about the castle that we can no longer see or can't work out. The Tudor wing was bolted on to the existing castle. So a little bit like when you have a phone contract and you add some data on and it's like a bolt on. The Tudor wing was bolted on to the end of the original medieval castle. Lots of other medieval castles were knocked down in the early modern period when they rebuilt them to be more luxurious. But Skipton wasn't. They just bolted the Tudor wing onto the end. So that's a massive benefit for us because we can still see the medieval structure and also the new structure for early modern comfort. There's a challenge though in terms of Skipton Castle in the early modern period because Many of those defensive features that were present during the Civil War were removed in Oliver Cromwell's slighting. So things like the thickened and the heightened walls, the flat roofs, the cannons, all of these were either destroyed or melted down. So we can't actually see what Skipton looked like in the English Civil War. So that's a challenge to us. The final third point would be the benefit in that Lady Anne Clifford rebuilds Skipton Castle, and in her rebuilding she preserves the site. So between 1657 and 1659 she preserves the castle by rebuilding it, and that as a result we have one of the best preserved castles in England today. So that's a huge benefit for us because we can view a castle and learn from a castle in incredibly good condition because of her rebuild. If she hadn't rebuilt it, it almost certainly would have turned just into some crumbling rocks. So final one is how typical Skipton Castle is in the early modern period. So again, we've got those 3 points, two to why it's typical, and one to why it's not. So the first reason for why it's typical is that Skipton Castle was, like many other sort of castles and country homes, in the early modern period, it was upgraded to be more luxurious, more comfortable. So it had lots of significant improvements following the marriage with Lady Eleanor Brandon. The adding of the Tudor wing and the octagonal tower is a really classic example of this. So again, in these answers, we're linking to other castles or other sort of country houses, and we're saying, yeah, it is typical because many other castles improve their facilities to make them more luxurious in the early modern period, such as Baynard's Castle and Hardwick Hall. The second thing we could talk about is that the castle is brought back into action for the Civil War. So it upgrades itself and makes itself more strong defensively ahead of the Civil War, and that's typical. Skipton Castle went back to being a fortress during the Civil War for King Charles I. They brought soldiers in from York, they placed cannons on the roof. This is typical because lots of other castles were brought back into service for the Civil War. Some fighting for Parliament, some fighting for the King, such as Bolton Castle, Pontefract Castle and Sandal Castle. Now again, to make sure we've got balance, we do need to have a not typical. Now, Skipton Castle was rebuilt by Lady Anne Clifford between 1657 and 1659. She lowers the walls, she puts windows in instead of arrow slits, and she plants the yew tree to show the period of peace. Now, that's really not typical, because after the Civil War, many castles were just left to rot and ruin, like Sandal Castle, Pontefract Castle, and Corfe Castle. They were all just left to ruin, whereas Skipton was rebuilt. So that's really not typical, and that's not a typical thing for other castles. The industrial period, I've not put a slide on the industrial period because there's not really much to say other than in the period 1750 to 1900, Skipton Castle's used as a country house. It's used by the wealthy Tufton family for hunting. But apart from that, nothing really happens. It just sort of declines and becomes quite dilapidated. So that's it really for the industrial period. There's not really much else to say on that. So what was the state of Skipton Castle between 1900 and 1950? Well, like I've just said, in the industrial period, Skipton had gradually fallen into disrepair. During World War II, it was used by the British Museum to protect valuable exhibits like the Oriental collection. So when the Nazis were bombing London during the Blitz between 1940 and 1941, Skipton Castle put the Oriental collection underneath the Great Hall as a way of protecting it from the bombing in London. So that's an activity that you could, or a significant point that you could talk about for the 20th century. As a thank you for this, the British Museum gave Skipton Castle a set of Irish elk antlers, which you can still see in the Great Hall today. In the early 1950s, there was discussions about Butlins, a holiday camp, buying Skipton Castle and turning it into a big sort of holiday camp. But successful businessman Wilfred Fattorini, he didn't want this for the castle. He didn't want it to be a holiday camp. He was born in Skipton. He wanted to preserve it as a piece of history for the people of Skipton. So from 1955, Wilfred Fattorini purchases Skipton Castle and starts to rebuild it and to modernise it and to restore it for the people of Skipton. In terms of 20th century activities, things that happen at the site, you could talk about three things. You could talk about it being a safe house for the valuable museum exhibits during World War II. They stored the Oriental collection underneath the Great Hall to protect it from bombing. The second one you could talk about was the home of the Fattorini family. The Fattorini family still live in the Tudor wing of the castle today. They move into the Tudor wing in 1977. It's the main residence for the eldest Fattorini child, called Sebastian Fattorini. So you could say that it's the home of the Fattorini family still, and that's an activity that happens there. The third activity you could talk about for the 20th century would be that it's a very popular tourist site. Still, it's used by tourists, by schools, for people to go and to visit and to learn from the castle. It's also used by historical enthusiasts who might do historical reenactments and like reenacting battles in the grounds of the castle. So some of your significant points in the 20th century are that it was used to store artefacts during World War II. So that's significant because it's protecting nationally important artefacts. You could talk about the Fattorini family purchasing it in 1955, 1956. They restore the castle. They bring it up to its former glory. They make it a safe place for people to visit again. And you could also talk about it being a significant turning point in 1987 when the Fattorini family open it as a tourist site to the public. They're getting money for people visiting the site, and that's significant because it helps the castle stay in a good state of repair and it keeps the castle well preserved. Some significant physical features you could mention from the 20th century. The school lunchroom. So that's where you guys had your lunch. The school lunchroom is really significant because it shows the role of the castle and what the role of the castle in education. The school lunchroom is built into the rear curtain wall at the back of the castle, and it's significant because it shows that the castle is being used to educate young people on a day-to-day basis. The second significant physical features could be the features for tourists, the toilets, the gift shop, the ticket office. The tourist facilities, like the toilets and the gift shop and the ticket office, they're really significant because they show how the castle provides for tourists. They show ways that it makes money in order to keep the castle in good condition, charging for things in the gift shop, people buying tickets. This is significant because all of this money contributes to keeping the castle in really good condition. The final thing we could mention is the front lawn and the gardens. Now, the front lawn and the gardens are significant because they're often used by historical enthusiasts to reenact battles and key events from Skipton's history. Now, that's significant because it's using the castle for enthusiasts to reenact these battles, and it's a way that people are still in contact with the castle today and people are still using the castle for entertainment and for leisure. So in terms of it being important nationally and locally, here we've got 3 points, 2 national and 1 local. So again, if you've got a question about importance nationally or locally, and you chose to talk about the 20th century, you've got 3 points here that you could use. So like I've already said, it's nationally important because during the Blitz, it protects artefacts that are of national importance. That Oriental collection that was stored in the British Museum was put under Skipton Castle's Great Hall during the Blitz to protect it from the German bombing. It's important nationally in the 20th century because it's one of the best preserved castles in England. So that's a national thing. It's one of the most impressive and best preserved castles in England, and it's a strong historical record of a medieval castle. Over 100,000 people visit Skipton Castle each year because of its quality, because it's so well preserved and it's in such good condition. People enjoy going round it. It's important locally because the market still runs. The market charter that was granted by King John in 1204 is still valid and it's still held by the castle. And this allows Skipton to hold a very busy market 4 times a week. This means the castle is important locally because the castle still holds the market charter and it makes Skipton a busy and a profitable place, which brings lots of money to the local economy. Now, we've mentioned some of this already, but from 1950, the Fattorini family become involved in the castle. Between 1955 and 1956, sort of on that winter between the two, Skipton Castle is bought by Wilfred Fattorini, that wealthy Skipton businessman. And he spends a long time, between 1956 and 1977, he restores the castle and has parts of it rebuilt so that it was livable and it could be used as a tourist attraction. In 1977, the Fattorini family move into the octagonal tower and the long gallery, and as I've said, Sebastian Fattorini still uses it as his main residence today. In 1987, it opens as a tourist site to the general public. It's one of the biggest attractions in Yorkshire, and because of that, they build a number of tourist features to accommodate the tourists that are coming to them, about 100,000 a year. So they build toilets, a cafe, a gift shop, a school lunchroom, and a ticket office. In terms of the beliefs, attitudes and values question, to be honest, it's quite difficult for the 20th century. If you got that question, I personally would answer on the early medieval or the early modern. I think the 20th century one is quite difficult. But there are 2 points you could write. You could say that Skipton Castle shows people's attitudes. They're interested in history in the 20th century. The tourist facilities built at Skipton by the Fattorinis, the toilets, the lunchroom, the gift shop, they do show that people have a desire to learn about and experience history. 100,000 people a year is a big number. So it does show that there's still a lot of people who have interest in history in the 20th century. The fact that the Fattorini family restore and preserve the castle also shows that there's an interest in preserving history. So the fact that they rebuild and preserve it shows that people are interested in looking after and restoring and preserving historical sites in the 20th century. So how typical is Skipton Castle in the 20th century? We've got a few points that we could talk about. 3 points again. 1 typical and 2 not typical. So during World War II, it was pretty typical for castles to be involved in the war effort in some way. Skipton Castle was used, as we've already said, to protect the Oriental collection from German bombing during the Blitz. Now this is typical because many other castles in World War II were used to help the war effort. Like at Richmond Castle, it was used as an army barracks, and castles off the coast were fitted with anti-aircraft guns, such as Pendennis Castle in Cornwall. The second reason why it's not typical is that it's never been demolished or taken down. Skipton Castle is still in the same place with the same building as it was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Now this is not typical because after World War II, lots of building was happening in Britain. Building of motorways, housing estates, like main roads. And so many castles and country estates were actually knocked down to make way and make space for the new motorways and new housing estates. And very few castles actually remain. Conway Castle and the Tower of London are 2 notable examples. But that makes Skipton Castle not typical because it's one of the few that weren't demolished after World War II. The last reason is our second for why it's not typical. So our third reason. Now Skipton Castle is privately owned and it's protected and owned by the Fattorini family. Now that's very, very unusual. there's very few big castles and big country houses that are privately owned today. Usually they're owned by big national charities like the National Trust and English Heritage. So the fact that it's privately owned is really unusual and therefore not very typical. So on the back of the unit on a page, which you guys can access from our history website, and you've also had copies in school, you've got a timeline of Skipton Castle with the different periods and key things that happen in those time periods. Please speak to your teacher if you want any help or if you need any more copies of the unit on a page. There'll be another video to go alongside this as to how to answer Skipton Castle questions. This one was just about the content. Thank you.